We're going to go ahead and get started. It's a little after 12. Welcome to Americans United's first Twitter Space event. We'll be talking about religious freedom in public schools and our new Know Your Rights guides for students, parents, and teachers. I am Rob Boston, Senior Advisor at Americans United and editor of AU's magazine, Church and State. We are excited that you're here. Our speakers today are Rachel Lazar, President and CEO of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and Ian Smith, a staff attorney at AU. Rachel is a lawyer, an advocate, and a strategist who has dedicated her career to making our country more inclusive. She has a proven track record of uniting both faith and secular leaders and advocacy organizations to make tangible progress on some of the most important issues of our time. She's also the first woman and the first non-Christian to lead Americans United during our nearly 75-year history. Ian handles legal intake of new church-state separation complaints and pursues non-litigation advocacy to attempt to resolve violations without the need for lawsuits. He has been with Americans United for 13 years. Rachel, why don't you say a few words to get us off today, start us off today?
Thanks, Rob. And so nice to be with everyone. As COVID cases surge across the nation and students are heading back to school, the last thing that students, parents, and teachers should be worrying about is their religious freedom rights. But despite the fact that the U.S. Supreme Court struck down school-sponsored prayer 6 decades ago, our organization, Americans United, fields hundreds of reports from children, parents, and educators about religious freedom violations in public schools every year. In fact, it's our most common complaint that we receive. And that's why we've created 3 Know Your Rights guides for public school students, parents, and teachers. So everyone knows and understands their religious freedom rights and responsibilities in public schools. Religious freedom and public schools are 2 essential ingredients to building a strong democracy where we can all come together as equals. And we all know that our democracy needs our full attention right now. It's been Americans United's mission for the past 75 years to protect both of these values, and our Know Your Rights guides are just the way to do that. So Ian, here with me today, was the primary author of the Know Your Rights guides. He's a superstar at Americans United. Sometimes we call him our secret weapon. And he's AU's point person who reviews and responds to all of the reports of violations that we receive from people all across the country every year. So Ian, do you want to fill us in on how many of the complaints we receive involve public schools?
Sure. And thanks, Rachel, for that kind introduction. And thanks to everybody for, showing up to listen. So I've been doing this for over a decade, as Rob said. And although we don't track things specifically by subject matter area, I can tell you we get hundreds of complaints every year. And the vast majority of them are public school complaints, right? I would say as many as 2/3 easily. And, there are several other organizations that work in the same space, the church-state separation space. They get reports on violations. I would wager to guess that the same ratios hold true for them. So it's, even though this has been settled law for a long time, it's still a huge problem. And I just want to say, like, a lot of people think that, it's all southern states, the Bible Belt, Texas, stuff like that. That's just not the case. Like, we get complaints from all over the country, right? Like, I get complaints from, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Iowa, Idaho, right? In total, like, the second highest ranking state for number of complaints we get is California. So this is definitely not just a South problem. It is a whole country problem.
Yeah, I went to public school in Chicago, and as a religious minority, as a Jewish person, I feel very fortunate that I didn't experience any religious freedom violations, but these problems definitely happen all over the country, like Ian was saying. And I just want to tell you about a couple of cases involving religious freedom violations. The first is one that could easily end up before the Supreme Court in the next year or so. And it involves a school district in Washington state that stopped a football coach from leading students in prayer on the 50-yard line after football games. The coach sued, claiming that he has a religious freedom right to lead his team in prayer. And I'm very proud to say that Americans United is representing the school district, which was correctly protecting students' religious freedom and ensuring that the coaches' students didn't feel pressured to, pray to play by a school authority figure. So that's one case. Another was one of our big cases in recent years involving a public school district in Louisiana. And we were able to secure a victory on behalf of several families who objected to pervasive religious coercion happening in the public schools in what was called the Bossier Parish School District. School events being held at churches or involving prayers as part of the official program, extensive promotion of religion within the school athletic programs, teachers proselytizing in classrooms and religious displays in classrooms and offices, really egregious violations. And we ultimately settled the case with the district. The district actually agreed to address the violations, which was great, and also to create a novel monitoring committee to review and address potential violations going forward. So we were really happy with that outcome, but we're not happy that we have to bring such cases.
Ian, the cases that Rachel's outlined in Louisiana and Washington, that sounds extreme, but is that par for the course? I mean, what are some of the common types of complaints that AU receives about religion in public schools?
Sadly, yeah, the things she was describing are like very common, especially religion in athletics, and even more than all other athletics combined in football. Like uh, like coaches being involved with Fellowship of Christian Athletes and injecting religion into sporting events is very, very common. I often joke that if you give me a phone book and let me flip to any random public school in the country with a football program, I'll find church state violations there. It's only a very small exaggeration. But yeah, prayer in classrooms, religious decorations in classrooms, prayer over the loudspeaker, over the loudspeaker at football games, and sometimes as part of like the morning announcements for the school, right? Prayer at school events, just allowing allowing Gideons to come onto school property to distribute Bibles, generally to fifth grade students, because there's a very specific things that the Gideons have about giving Bibles to kids of that age. Allowing youth pastors from local churches to come into schools and wander around unsupervised during lunchtime hours. I mean, all this sort of stuff is common. We get complaints about it all the time.
Ian, can
Hey,
you give us
Rob, I
some
just wanted to
ground
add one
rules?
thing to what
Sure.
Ian just said. Just even, in terms of the staff at Americans United, I think, this is one of the issues that unites so many of our staff in their shared experiences, no matter kind of what type of place they lived or religious background they're from. They have stories to tell. And in fact, if you follow us on Twitter at Americans United and or on Facebook or Instagram, we've been posting blogs that so many of our own staff have written, including you, Ian, and you, Rob. But just I think today I retweeted one from the head of our legal department, Richard, who grew up in Omaha, Nebraska, Jewish, at a public school where he and his sister were some of the only Jewish kids. And he actually wrote a really poignant blog about a Jehovah's Witness kid in his class who just didn't, feel comfortable from a religious standpoint, standing for the pledge or participating in Christmas and Easter, different celebrations, and was really sort of mocked and teased and totally excluded and left out based on that. And he just describes the the agony that he felt, as a kid, sort of witnessing that. And I can only imagine as a Jewish student who was sort of, kind of going along, that it must have been very painful on many levels, for him. So just wanted to say that I bet many of our listeners, have their own stories to tell or some of their own experiences, and we're here to, to the extent that this is going on, just that we're here to receive your reports and your complaints, and that's at au.org. Anyone can just go and file a report, and we'll follow up. So just wanted to say that. Rob, back to you.
Thanks for that, Rachel. Uh, Ian, we know that the separation of church and state must be respected in public schools, but that doesn't mean the schools have to be religion-free zones. I mean, that's a phrase I hear Christian nationalist groups, who of course oppose the very idea of public education. I hear them throw that term around. Oh, the schools are religious-free zones. If a kid sneezes, a friend can't even say "God bless you," and we know that these are not accurate depictions of public education. So give us some ground rules. What can the schools do? What can they not do?
Sure, I can do that. So the very basic thing that you got to remember that sometimes seems to elude people is that the public schools are arms of the government of whatever state they happen to be in, right? Teachers are government employees, administrators are government employees, right? So the government is not allowed to endorse religion. That doesn't say anything you might notice about the students. So your basic ground rules are that the school and its employees can't conduct, sponsor, endorse prayer. They can't, display religious iconography, right? They can't force students to take a Bible or do any other kind of coercive activity like making them go to church for school events, right? Teachers, on the other hand, can pray in their free time as long as they're not disrupting classroom instruction or proselytizing other students unwantedly. Now, students have the ability to do things like form Bible clubs, right? And, have their own religious like Bible studies and stuff like that. Teachers, in fact, can do the same thing as long as they are not within eyeshot or earshot of students. So if they have their own like Bible study during their lunchtime in the teacher's lounge, that's all fine too, right? Just so long as it's not directed at students. In the curriculum, public schools can teach objective information about religion, like the role of religion in history or in culture, but they can't preach that a religion is true or false, and they can't encourage students to practice a particular religion. Holding classes and activities in houses of worship with uncovered iconography is not allowed. If you remove all of it, and you just use like a mess hall or something in a church, then it might be okay, depending on what kind of, whether you pass crosses or whatnot on the way in. You can't allow the schools can't allow outsiders to come in and proselytize. So the school can't invite people to come in and do the kinds of religious things that it's not allowed to do, right? You can't get around the law by just making private people do it. And one fairly controversial one, public schools can close for religious holidays if they have a non-religious reason for closing. And the most common one is that there's so many absentees in terms of the students and the teachers that it would be pointless to open the school because everybody'd have to make everything up anyway. But they can't close if the only reason that they have is that we want to close on this religious holiday. That I encourage people, if you want more details on all this stuff, to go check out the Know Your Rights guys. They're more comprehensive, although not as comprehensive as a lawyer like me is sometimes comfortable with. But again, as Rachel said, if you ever encounter a situation where you have a question about whether something is legal, feel free to file a complaint with us. All the complaints come to me and I review them. So I'm happy to give more detail on those sorts of situations.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Ian. Rachel mentioned that you're one of AU's best kept secrets because you work so closely with our non-litigation program. And that's a very important program because we're addressing these complaints outside of court. Now that's very important to be able to handle things outside of court. But it also was done sort of a little quieter, and maybe not a lot of people know about those successes that we have all over the country with the non-litigation program because we don't publicize the work. Can you tell us why that is, Ian?
Sure. The biggest reason is just that over the years, and this program has been running since the mid to late 90s, somewhere like 96 or something, right? I think generally speaking, what we've found is that although all of us that are probably on this chat would like to think that people would share our outrage right at a government official endorsing religion or injecting religion into the public school, eh, I find that we've found that if you publicize this sort of thing, it tends to actually draw out people that support the behavior, right? So you just get a flood of people into like a school board meeting or something, telling them that they're doing the right thing by putting God back in the schools. And we've generally found that keeping it quiet, right, not putting it in the press, takes the pressure off of the principals and the superintendents and the school boards to not have to deal with that sort of outside pressure to continue doing something, especially if their lawyer looks at the letter we've sent them and says, yeah, this is not okay, you should stop, right? Being able to do that quietly under the board has a better success rate than trying to put that public pressure on. Now, we do the public pressure sometimes if we think it would make a difference. But generally speaking, we found it to be more effective in getting good results to not do that. And also, many of the people that report these complaints really want to remain anonymous. Like they have to live in these communities. Sometimes they have businesses, they have children in the schools, right? And they really don't want people like trying to hunt them down and figure out who they are, right? And retaliate against them. So, anything we can do to help people that have those concerns and want to remain anonymous, we do that as well.
Yeah, I'll jump off of that, Ian. It's really unfortunate that there have been some horror stories involving people being persecuted for speaking up about church-state separation violations. And again, when you're from a location like I am, in Chicago, or maybe some other, major cities, it just feels like that doesn't really happen. And it's not really scary to proclaim yourself to be an atheist, or it's not scary to say my religious freedom rights were violated by the majority. But in so many places across the country, it is actually even sort of life endangering at times. And I actually want to just share a couple of stories from litigation, our own litigation in the past. So Americans United represented a New Jersey school district that stopped a football coach from leading prayers about a decade ago. And community members there just assumed that the two Jewish cheerleaders had initiated the complaints about the coach's prayers. And those girls were bullied and taunted at athletic events. And they were also harassed with anti-Semitic abuse online. Another really disturbing story is back in 2004, a woman from South Carolina who objected to her town council always opening meetings with Christian prayers was the victim of very violent harassment. This is just hard to even tell, but someone broke into her home and beheaded her pet parrot and left a note that read, "You're next." There was also a case of ours where a client objected to an unconstitutional Ten Commandments monument that was erected at the Alabama courthouse. And she came home from her honeymoon to find that someone had shot out her windows. So it's just really scary to be a plaintiff because there's still huge violent resistance to this foundational part of America's DNA, which is at its root about equality. And some just refuse to give up their advantage. And so they're, fighting with all they've got, tooth and nail, to maintain their advantage and their power. And, with the changing demographics in our society, they kind of feel it, I think, slipping between their fingers. But it doesn't it doesn't reduce the violence and the threat. And it does mean, like Ian was saying, that we often do have to declare our plaintiffs to be anonymous to protect them.
I think we really have to salute all those brave plaintiffs out there who take these cases on, even though they know they may encounter some of this hostility. Remember, organizations like ours, we can't just go into court and sue unless we're representing somebody. And it's really a lot of brave people who have helped advance the law in this area. Let's move on to some questions from our listeners. We had some that were submitted last week during this campaign. Let's start with a few of those. We touched on this already. This question of what you can do when it comes to religion and religious expression in public schools. But this questioner really wanted us to flesh this out as it relates to students. And I do think that is an important question because there is so much misinformation out there. In reality, public school students have the ability to engage in voluntary religious activity at a pretty high level. Isn't that right, Rachel?
Absolutely. To paraphrase the Supreme Court, students don't lose their religious freedom when they enter the schoolhouse gates, not at all. They can choose to pray, they can read the Bible or other religious texts, they can form religious clubs. These activities just have to be led by students and not initiated or forced by teachers or school officials. That's sort of the key distinguishing factor. And also, students can't proselytize other students or disparage other students' religious beliefs. And, let's just not forget that this all comes back to sort of a core principle in our country, which is the principle of religious freedom, right? And that what religious freedom is about is all of our freedom to live and believe as we choose, not just some of our freedom. So really, it's a value that's rooted in equality, as much as it's rooted in freedom. And what it means is that religious minorities or non-religious kids, and no matter who you are, right, in whatever school district, whatever the majority is there, if you're in the minority, that, you're the government, right, and public schools, of course, are a facet of the government, have an obligation to treat you equally and protect your religious freedom equally. And that's just want to come back to, that's what we're talking about. So, these activities that I named that students can do, they can do without sort of making some students feel, lesser than other students, or they can do it without, in any sense, the school or the government, right, which is what these schools are acting as, sort of favoring one set of religious beliefs over another, or over non-religious beliefs. But so long as that's not happening, students have a lot of opportunities for religious expression in public schools.
Yeah, and just to jump in there, like where schools generally cross the line here is when staff participate in those religious activities with students or encourage students to do these things, right? FCA is a big violator here, Fellowship of Christian Athletes. Like, it's been around for so long that I think a lot of like teachers, were in it as students, and now they think, oh, I used to do this when I was a student, so I'll go to FCA and pray with students and talk about Bible things. And you can't do that, right? It has to be student led. It's not that, I mean, students have, as Rachel just said, a great deal of leeway to engage in these religious activities, but it has to be their choice. Another example of a letter we wrote that did end up in the media, as it turns out, is a situation where a Kentucky school was allowing what initially looked like students to put up what was called a prayer locker. They put up a little thing on their locker, and they encouraged people to drop prayers in, and then they would say them for people. Except that when you scratch the surface, it became clear that the entire endeavor was thought up and put into motion by two of the teachers at the school, right? So although the kids may have put up the prayer locker, it was teachers that put them up to it, and that crosses the constitutional line. Can't do that.
Thanks for that clarification. Now, just because a student is doing something doesn't mean it's always okay, though. Let's say, for example, we have students praying at public events like the graduation ceremony or the football game, or reading a prayer over a morning announcement. That's not going to be okay, is it, Ian?
No. In most cases, those things are unconstitutional. What you really have to look at is, okay, if it's an official school activity, right? Like something that the school is putting on, like at graduation or football games, is draped in the school colors. The school officials control what happens there, right? Then even if you have a student doing it, it's probably at the school's behest, right? Like the school has decided who speaks. They've decided what topics are okay for them to talk about, right? A lot of times they edit, what the student is allowed to say or can censor the student's speech. That's not private. That's not the student just, spontaneously doing something. That is the school arranging to have a prayer, and they're using a student to do it. Just like I said earlier, you can't invite like outside people to come in and proselytize students. The school can't utilize students to do something that it can't do itself, right? There are some very limited instances where the school could theoretically like allow students to speak without any control taken by the school at all, right? Like no reviewing their speeches, no editing it for anything. They allow a wide variety of students to speak, right? In those situations, you might have a situation that might be a situation in which you can have maybe a student engaging in some kind of religious speech. But I will tell you right now, the situations, the instances where I've seen where I've thought a school legitimately did that are very rare.
I think, Ian, that the one key point, in what you're saying is that students and obviously sometimes family members, or when they're joining in for something at school, they're a captive audience at school, or at school events, and also that, let's just all think back to when we were students and how very vulnerable we felt, and also, typically not even able to articulate that vulnerability or not even sort of aware of everything that was going on except for just feeling feelings. And I remember I played field hockey, which was really important to me. And I just remember that like pleasing my coach was everything, and I was acutely attuned to how my coach was reacting to me, or wanting her to see me work extra hard when we had to do sprints or whatever. So when a coach is sort of leading a prayer at the 50-yard line, just as an example, in football, or if my field hockey coach did that, I would feel like very afraid that I would not get playtime, if I didn't go along, and that's what happens. So there's this facet of being a captive audience. There's this facet of just fearing sort of retaliation that are very, very real. And, it's like, again, thinking back to when we were kids, just things that your school teacher said or that your school said to be true were sort of true, right? And so if your school makes you feel like, if their school is even sort of quietly endorsing, a religion, that really makes you feel like your own religion is lesser, or the school's endorsing something that's not yours and the government is, and that's very problematic. So I think we all need to also remind people what it's like to be a school child, and what that could feel like.
One of our Twitter
Yeah,
followers.
absolutely. And
I'm
hang
sorry.
on,
Go ahead, Ian.
just a second, Rob. I just wanted to amplify what Rachel just said there because it's really important. The law considers, and this is one of the reasons why school church state law has been settled for so long. The law considers a public school to be an inherently coercive environment, right? Because students are there by law, right? You have to send your kid to school. You either have to homeschool them or you have to send them to school, right? Otherwise, they're truant, right? So the law enforces their presence. And, all of those like, social pressures and other things are heightened for, younger people. So it's a really important point, right? Like school is considered by the law to be a coercive environment.
Thanks for that important point, Ian. One of our Twitter followers wanted us to shift the focus a little bit to teachers. We've talked a lot about what students can and can't do. What about teachers? Are they ever allowed to pray or express their religious beliefs in public schools? Ian, what do you say about that?
Sure. Yes, they absolutely are. I think I mentioned it a little bit earlier. They can engage in religious activities when they're not in view of students, right? So on a break, on lunch, in a private area, in the teacher's lounge, an unused classroom, anything like that, right? Like they can come together, they can pray, they can have Bible studies, they can do all those sorts of things. Teachers can also have like personal religious items. Usually, like small crosses or other sorts of clothing items like that. They can have Bibles. They're not supposed to have them out where students can see them, but if you have it with you so that you can do your Bible study, that's okay, right? Um, One thing I do want to say about teachers, which I forgot to mention earlier, right, is that teachers also, because they're government employees, have the right to be free of religious proselytizing if in the workplace, right? So it's also sadly common for teachers to experience unwanted prayer from administration officials, right? Like so, the principal at an in-service will have a prayer, or superintendent, like when school starts for the year, at the opening convocation will have a prayer, right? We had one in Arizona not too awful long ago where the principal invited actually 8 pastors to speak for an hour and a half about religion and about how God would protect the people from COVID. So, like, the teachers have the right to engage in religious activities, but they also have the right to be free of religion from superiors and as part of school activities.
And Ian, I'll just brag on your and our behalf. You just referenced the Arizona issue, where we really heard from multiple teachers who were, pretty taken aback, right, that they were subjected to 90 minutes of Bible quotes, Christian prayers, requests that participants raise their hands to show their belief in God, and also pronouncements that God would protect them from COVID-19. And so, we immediately, through Ian's work, alerted the district that the event was unconstitutional because a public school district cannot proselytize its teachers. And within a day, our complaint had generated a public apology and a promise not to include religious content in future staff events. So we're really so glad that we're able to help teachers in cases like this, address their religious freedom rights as well as students and parents.
We're being asked about religious displays. Can teachers or administrators display religious symbols like a cross or the Ten Commandments in a classroom or an office? And what about some of these states that are passing laws that require public schools to display signs reading "In God We Trust"? Is that legal?
Sorry, Rob, I had a little technical difficulty there. Can you repeat that?
Yes, this is a question, Ian, about religious displays. Under what circumstances, if there are any, where a teacher or administrator may be able to display things like crosses or the Ten Commandments in a classroom or an office? And a related question about the display of "In God We Trust" signs that some states are mandating public schools display.
So yeah, teachers uh, not and administrators not allowed to put up religious displays, crosses, Bible verses, Ten Commandments, pictures of Jesus or other religious figures in the common areas of the school, in classrooms, in the hallways. Right, they're government employees. The things that they display are information that the school, the government is endorsing. Right, that it wants the students to see. Um, it's a little the question in the law is a little iffier in terms of like private spaces like offices and other things. Generally speaking, if a student's going to come in there fairly often, then it's legally problematic for them to have any kind of religious display where a student can see it. But if the student never comes into their office, then maybe they can have religious displays then. The school can create places where students can display their work or their own private speech that can have religious things in it, religious content in it. But the school has to be careful to treat all students' work the same. So you can't like put the religious stuff up front and center and like amplify it over everything else. You got to treat everything equally. And I think I'll let Rachel handle the "In God We Trust" bit of it, because unfortunately, "In God We Trust" is something that is not necessarily illegal, and that we have we oppose, but have a more difficult relationship with.
Who knew that "In God We Trust" is ceremonial and historical and not religious? But unfortunately, that's the way that the courts have seen it. And so, right now, for example, there's been a big effort by this sort of state legislative arm of the Christian nationalist movement in this country, aptly called Project Blitz, which has been pushing states to pass bills that promote Christian nationalism in public schools, including, displaying "In God We Trust" in schools. And, they claim that it's simply, promoting patriotism to display the national motto. But we know that it's really an effort to insert religious beliefs into our schools. And in fact, several of the legislators that have been the key supporters of these bills have said and argued openly that it's a way for them to, quote, "get God back in schools." So, it's true that the courts haven't sort of gone what we would say is the right way on this, but it doesn't mean that governments must display this in their schools. And, we would strongly argue they shouldn't. And so I urge everyone who's, part of our movement to let their state legislators and school boards know that they oppose these types of displays. And, let's just not forget that the sort of religious extremists have waged a very successful movement across sort of the state and local governments to, infuse their point of view and be advocates, at things like school board meetings, and frankly, like at lots of local functions. And let's not underestimate the power of our own voices. We need to show up too, and again, just because these things right now are deemed to be permissible doesn't mean that they're requirements, or that they have to exist. And it's just, I think, very important for us to show up and tell our stories in these local functions and remind folks about why these are religious freedom violations.
Before we wrap up, I wanted to ask a question about an issue that pops up a lot in the context of public education, and that is creationism or attacks on evolution. I know that's a complicated issue, but Ian, could you just say a few words about where the law stands on teaching creationism in public school science classes?
Sure, you can't do it.
Okay, thanks.
It's a religious view on the origin of life, right? So, like, it had the only purpose for teaching it is to sort of endorse that religious viewpoint, right? It doesn't have any scientific value. So, like, it has been repeatedly knocked down, both pure creationism and its related pseudoscientific cousin, intelligent design. So those are not allowed to be taught in public school science classes. There may be some way that they can be put into, like, if you're teaching, like, if you need to teach the Genesis story as a story in, like, an English class, to relate it to some reference in another work or something, you might be able to do that. But that's very different from teaching that, life was created by God.
And again, I just want to speak to a point that Ian made earlier, which is that, these violations are happening all over the country. And Ian said earlier that, these complaints and reports that we get in, the number 2 place that we get them in from is California. Right. And people might not think that that's happening in California, but it's happening everywhere. And, Ian was just speaking about these, sort of intelligent design, another label for teaching creationism. And, Americans United fought a case in Pennsylvania just in recent years, which we proudly won, but where this was going on. So, again, it's, even if you think it's not a problem, think again. It's unfortunately a very real problem, and even something like this that one would think was sort of resolved many decades ago still isn't.
Good point, Rachel. We know we've seen our legislative department, public policy department has seen bills in states that would attempt to shoehorn creationism back into public schools. Definitely something we're keeping an eye on. We are running out of time. We're going to wrap up. We've had a great conversation. I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to provide us with some last thoughts. Ian, why don't you go first?
Sure. I would say that we like people have often have like a an aversion to filling out our complaint form and say, I don't want to bother you. I don't know if this is a problem, right? And I would encourage you, if you have even a suspicion, right, that you've experienced a violation of your religious freedom or church-state separation in public school in your community, go ahead and fill the form out on our website. It's on our homepage at au.org. Fill it out, report it. I try and answer all of them if I can. Sometimes it takes me a little longer, but I do try and answer them all. And I don't mind it if somebody fills out a complaint for something that is not a violation. I'll tell you it's not a violation, right? I'll explain why. But I would much rather you err on the side of caution, come to us, and try and get the best information possible than to leave something that turns out to actually be a violation going on when maybe we could stop it. And, for anybody that's concerned about it, we keep your identity confidential. We don't reveal who you are to anyone or share your contact information without your express permission. I do ask, though, that if you fill out the form, do give me some legitimate way to contact you, because sometimes I have questions that I need to ask to fill out my understanding of what's going on. And if some people are so concerned about anonymity, they fill it out with fake names, fake email addresses, right? And if that happens and I don't have enough information, then there's nothing I can really do about it. So I would encourage you to give me a way to contact you, and I will, but we won't share any of it.
I guess, Rob, I would just conclude by imploring our listeners to share our Know Your Rights guides with just anyone in their life who's connected to public schools. One of the greatest challenges for nonprofits is not sort of doing the substantive work, but making sure that it's not just, sort of sitting dusty on our shelves. And boy, is that an old-fashioned metaphor today. But dissemination is a really big challenge. It's actually a place where I think a lot of nonprofits fall down. And I know that we really have tried our hardest to get these guides out there, and we co-lead public education coalition in town, because we do a lot of work opposing private school vouchers as well. So we obviously are working with all those partners to disseminate the guides and have our own list, but we would just love your help in getting the word out, because I think these are really excellent resources, Ian, that you've created and the legal team has created. They're just very easy to understand, and we all really deserve to know what our rights are, because that's sort of step one to making sure that they're being protected. So, you can find them at au.org. You should definitely follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Americans United. We share all sorts of information like this and fun TikToks that are wonderful. Social media head Amy Couch has been helping us create. And I'm just so happy that you were able to join us today, and also that we've had such great engagement with these Know Your Rights guides and this campaign. And I guess I just conclude by saying that, what we stand for is everyone's right to live and believe in as they choose. And what we feel is that that's the way to ensure sort of equality and a stronger democracy, and that's really in trouble these days. And we're trying to do our part, and we're so happy to have you with us. So thank you for being with us, and we look forward to many more conversations in the future.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Ian. And thanks to all of you who participated. This ends our Twitter space. We'll see you next time.